So I'm here to talk to you about how I use photographs for storytelling, specifically for my journalism. So I can see that our audience members all have telephones, all have cameras, and I think that is kumbaga, the landscape that we are talking about nowadays. Everybody can be visual storytellers. Sa aking photography or photojournalism journey, when I was very young, nagsimula akong ma-interest sa mga litrato. Next slide please, nung ako ay bata pa lamang, meron kaming mga magazine sa bahay, mga lumang magazine na National Geographic, Life magazine. So nakikita ko doon yung mga pictures ng mga masters. Tapos I was really drawn to these photographs. Nagkataon, yung lolo ko, meron siyang lumang manual camera, yung Dewine pa, na gumagamit ng film. Basically, ninakaw ko yun. Iniram ko sa lolo ko, at nagpaalam na lang ako later on. And then I started taking pictures. Ito yung mga ilan sa unang mga photographs na kinunan ko. Nag-road trip kami nun sa Bataan. At dala ko yung camera, manual focus, manual exposure, meron kang limited roll of film, and then I started taking pictures. This was one of the churches that we visited. Next slide. Nagpunta kami sa may Dalampasigan. Picture ng mga manging isda. And then, kahit na anong makita ko, nililitratuhan ko. Next slide. Kasama na ang mga nyog. So, I think that everybody who starts their photojournalism or photography journey, talagang they just take photos of whatever is interesting around them. At doon sa process na yun, doon tayo natututo. But that was a different era of photography. Tulad na nabanggit ko kanina, kailangan ka bumili ng film na hindi mura. Meron kang usually 24 shots or 36 shots. Yung mga medyo matanda sa audience na intindihan yung sinasabi ko, pero yung mga medyo bata-bata, baka nagtataka na, 24 shots. Bakit 24? Bakit hindi 10? Bakit hindi 20? It's basically 24, 36. Meron ka iba-ibang mga rolls ng film, iba-iba yung mga itsura nun, iba yung itsura ng, halimbawa, Kodak Gold, iba yung itsura ng Fujifilm, Velvia, iba-iba yan. Iba-iba yung ISO, dapat marunong ka pumili kung ano yung ISO, depende kung ano yung shoot mo mga pictures. At marami na rin ako naaksayang pera sa kakadevelop ng film na wala namang magandang litrato na lumalabas. Okay. So, this was how I understood, learned to take photographs. Fast forward to today, next slide please. How do I use photography today? So, my meandering journey eventually took me to the world of journalism. I started as a program researcher in ABS-CBN. I was doing documentaries. I became a field reporter for ABS-CBN also. And then I transferred to GMA. Now, I focus more on what is called long-form journalism. Specifically, mga documentaries for TV. So meron kaming, ang difference niya from the news reports that I used to do, meron kang mas mahabang panahon na kaya mong bumabad kasama ng iyong mga subjects. Depende kung ano yung mga story na ginagawa ninyo. Ngayon, gamit yung journalism ko, yung aking interest in photography, parang napagsama ko yung dalawa. At ngayon, I focus on using my journalism to basically complement the stories that we do for television. Next slide, please. So, isa sa mga favorite or isa sa mga tumatatak sa akin na definition ng journalism is basically memory. We use journalism so that we can take a record of the moment and we can tell that story to other people. So in my journalism, I try to record things that are happening around us so that we can affirm what is true. Ano ba yung nangyari? Ano ba yung nangyari? Kailan nangyari? Kanino nangyari? Para kahit na lumipas na mahabang panahon, pwede nating balikan yung moment na yun at sabihin natin na nangyari ito sa mga taong ito at meron kaming record, meron kaming patunay na ito yung nangyari. So in my journalism, next slide, I like to shed light on the plight of people in the margins. Yung mga hindi madalas na napag-uusapan, wala masyadong boses sa ating lipunan. Picture ito ng mga kababayan nating Badjao sa Tawi-Tawi na nahihirapan mag-register ng kanilang births. So nagpunta kami doon at ito yung ilan sa mga litrato na nakunan doon. Next slide. So I think that journalism is also very important to shed light on the plight of people in the margins and also to show their struggles, their dreams, and their aspirations. Next slide. I also report on our collective failures. No? Pag nagkakaroon ng mga natural disasters, nagkakaroon ng gera, nagkakaroon ng conflict. Nagpunta kami sa Bangladesh noong 2017 to record the exodus of the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. Ito yung ilan sa mga litrato na nakuha natin. Next slide. So this was in Kutupalong Camp. Yung time na yun, tumatawid yung mga refugees from Myanmar to Cox's Bazar. Ito lang yung kanilang mga dalang ari-arian. Ilang mga sako, ilang mga lutuan, lalagyan ng tubig, at unti-unti silang tumatakas mula sa karahasan na kanilang nararanasan sa katabing bansa. Next slide. Ito yung mga bata na nakita ko naman na nagpupunta doon sa, basically, sa parang, sa fields para mag-gather ng mga little pieces of twigs and wood para may magamit sila na panggatong. Next slide. So, over the years, natuto akong kumuha ng what I hope to be better and better photographs. Just in the process of just taking lots and lots of photos. Sabi ko nga kanina, hindi naman, kahit yung mga pros, sasabihin sa inyo na dati kapag meron kang isang roll of film, isa o dalawa lang talaga dyan yung pwede mong gamitin at i-publish. But without maybe going into detail about this, because I know that all of us here take photos and all of us have an idea of what a good photo is. Let's just have a quick rundown of what makes a good photo. So, maswerte ako, next slide, na dahil nga dun sa experience ko with photography from a young age, medyo napilitan ako to learn the technical side of taking photos dahil sa wala pa namang auto anything noon eh. Kung gusto mong kumuha ng picture na tamang exposure, kailangan marunong kang gumamit ng ISO, alam mo yung shutter speed, alam mo yung aperture settings, etc. etc. For me, there are three things, or I can boil down what makes a good photographs into three things. Light, composition, and moment. So pag pinag-uusapan ng light, madalas itong napapakita yung exposure triangle. No? Hindi naman to, don't worry, hindi naman to lecture. Wala namang exam later on. So ano lang kayo, relax lang kayo dyan. So three things, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And usually, lalaroin mo yung tatlong bagay na yan depending on what you want to express in your photograph. So, shutter speed usually has to do with motion control, aperture sa depth of field, and ISO yung sensitivity and noise. So, next slide, pag pinag-usapan yung shutter, you can decide to freeze a moment by using a high shutter speed. Usually, this is good for sports, no? Gusto mong, or mga moments of high action. So, gagamit ka ng high shutter speed. But if you want to use a low shutter speed, you can actually show the motion tulad ng photo na ito, where it took a picture of a young girl who was a survivor of a very difficult crime. And she was walking along a field. So I used a shutter speed, not only because medyo madilim ng time na yan, pero gusto ko ipakita yung paggalaw ng mga grass tsaka ng kanyang motion. So you can use a low shutter speed. Next slide. Sa aperture naman, you can control the aperture. You can make it small or big. If you want to keep everything in focus, but if you want to also blur the foreground and background, you use a shallow or you use a big aperture, we call it. So dito, kung gusto mong i-blur yung sa harap, kailangan medyo malaki yung iyong aperture. Next slide. So ISO basically controls, for our purposes, it basically controls the amount of noise na nasa inyong photograph. Kung gusto niyo ng very smooth blacks, tulad ng picture na ito, you use a low ISO para wala masyadong noise. Pero may mga times na naman na gusto niyo ng konti, yung grainy, ngayon uso na rin yan eh. para maraming grain sa picture. So you usually use a high ISO for that. So sabi ko nga sa inyo, hindi naman to lecture, so let's move on. What else makes a good photograph? Composition. Before I go to composition, a few more examples of what I mean by light being an essential part and understanding light to be a good photographer and to take good pictures. So, habang kukuha ka ng pictures, next slide, medyo naiintindihan mo na yung mga qualities ng light. So, ako nowadays, pag nasa isang lugar ako, meron ka ng sixth sense na parang, uy, ganda ng ilaw. Tapos may isip mo, sayang wala ka na ng camera. Halimbawa ito, this is sunset in Myanmar. So, this is a picture of the different temples there. Tapos nakita mo yung parang dahil sa haze, nasa-separate yung background from the foreground. Next slide. Sometimes you also want to take pictures of high contrast. So merong mga very defined shadows. Tulad ng picture na ito, ito yung mga pag Semana Santa, yung mga flagellants na nag-whip sa Pampanga ata ito. Next slide. And sometimes it depends on the angle of the light that you have. If you want to show texture, you want the light to be at a certain angle para makita mo na, uy, meron pala mga footprints ng isang wild animal dito sa sand dune na ito. Next slide. At night, very challenging to shoot photos at night, but sometimes you can express and you can show the real, the real quality at yung nag-iiba ang itsura ng isang lugar kapag gabi. At minsan, doon mo nakikita yung totoong nature niya. So, ito ay picture sa isang, I think, after a disaster at sila ay gumagawa ng bonfire. So, medyo mahirap kunan kasi madilim. Pero parang iba yung vibe na nakukuha mo kumpara kung kukunan mo yan in the morning. Next slide. Composition. 10 minutes na lang. Composition. Very quickly lang din. Ano ba yung mga basic rules of composition? Next slide. So, we have the rule of thirds. Click please. So makita nyo na, oops, there you go. Wow, animation, high-tech. So you can divide your frame into sections and usually you can put the most interesting part of your photograph dun sa intersection ng mga lines na ito. So in this case, yung intersection nandun sa mukha ng bata. Next slide. Sometimes you want to use symmetry, yung pantay ng pantay, yung left and right, that also makes for a striking photograph. Like this one in Beijing. Next slide. Sometimes you want to use diagonal lines kapag you want to express something that's very dynamic in motion, hindi static. Tulad ng case study namin na ito, isang boxer in training. Next slide. And sometimes you want to use leading lines. No? Tulad naman ito na merong mga lines from the corners of your frame so that you're focused on the subject of your photograph. Next slide. Foreground and background elements also make for a more interesting photograph. Hindi lang very flat. Merong something going on in the foreground and then something going on in the background. So you can frame your subjects as well kung may mga natural framing elements. Next slide. This is one trick that I also employ. Please click. So, pag meron kang dominant eye, meaning yung pinaka-malapit usually dun sa camera, you can put that exactly at the center of your frame. And that makes it also very interesting. Next slide. You can also use color to convey meaning. No? Sometimes, pag-iisa lang yung kulay ng eksena, maganda siya tingnan sa camera. Next slide. And then, there's what we call the decisive moment, and every photographer knows this. No? Sabi ni Henry Cartier-Bresson, you take a photograph during the most decisive moment. So, next slide. Usually, when you take photographs of people, very guarded yan diba? Pero when you find a moment when they become vulnerable, they become, you earn their trust, and they show you their real side, that is the moment that you take a photograph. Next slide. So like, for example, in this picture in North Korea, usually yung mga kasama namin noon, parang lagi silang ready, lagi silang very stiff, handa sila na magpakita ng kanilang discipline, etc. Pero nung nagpunta ako sa parking lot sa likod, naghahanda pa lang yung mga girls para sa isang presentation, medyo naipakita na yung kanilang softer side. So for me, it makes for a more interesting photo because it's something that you don't usually see. Next slide. Of course, after all of this is said and done, ang dami ko nang nasabi, ang pinaka-importante is that you're able to express your personal style. So learn all of the tips, learn all of the tricks, learn all of the rules, but be ready to break it. Kasi kung gagamit ka ng rule of thirds palagi, sa totoo lang ang boring. Wala masyadong dating, no? Para basta nilagay mo dun sa intersection. But you have to know the rules, next slide, to be able to break it. So just take a photograph of what looks interesting to you, next slide. And eventually you will find your own personal style, how you're able to express yourself through the photos. Next slide. We're moving along now. Journalism ethics. I identify my photography in the broad category of photojournalism. Now, hindi naman importante sa akin ang labels. Hindi naman kailangan photojournalist ka lang, street photographer ka lang, editorial photographer ka lang, or art photographer ka lang. But in the world of photojournalism, there are certain standards and ethics that you have to follow because it's a very serious profession. Next slide. So, ang isang number one rule in photojournalism is you have to represent what is real. Your photos have to be accurate. Hindi ka pwede masyado mag-embellish, hindi mo pwedeng ipapose ang iyong mga subjects. Next slide. And you also can't overly process your photographs na hindi na siya makatotohanan. No? Yung masyadong mataas yung saturation, for example, hindi ka pwede magdagdag ng elements, hindi ka pwede magbawas, hindi mo pwede gawing mas maganda yung sunset. Ang dali-dali ginagawin ngayon yan dahil sa AI. So, ito yung mga ilan sa mga basic rules of journalism that also applies to photojournalism. So for me, next slide, I identify and I like this kind of photography because you are constrained by reality. Hindi mo pwedeng isipin na, di ba, gagandahan ko yung ano niyan after I process the photograph, dalagdagan ako ng mga elements to make it more interesting. So that is the kind of photography that I like doing, and that's part of my job. Next slide. Now, let's go to mobile photography. So kanina, napag-usapan natin that everybody owns a camera nowadays, and everybody can be a visual storyteller. The great thing about mobile photography is, ano yun? Sabi nga nila, the best camera is the one that you have with you. Nung nagsimula ako, ang laki-laki ng mga camera, ang bigat-bigat. Kaya pag may pinupuntahan ako, bumabiyahe ako, madalas iniiwan ko na lang kasi sumasakit na yung balikat ko. But nowadays, next slide, bumiyahe ako recently. I had my Xiaomi 14T with me. And I never missed good lighting like this one on the beach. No? People were enjoying their time. And I saw that the light was scattering doon sa parang mist na throw ng mga waves. And I had my camera with me. I had my Xiaomi 14T with me. So I was able to take the photograph. Next slide. The great thing about mobile photography also is that the cameras are very small and discreet. Kapag naglabas ka ng, meron sino bang may dala ng malaking camera dito? Yun, ang ganyang camera, pag naglabas ka ng ganyan sa labas, naku, tatakbuhan na yung mga tao or sobrang sila maka-conscious. So for shy people like myself, alam ko hindi halata but I'm very shy, when I'm in public, it's easier to take pictures when your camera is very small and when it looks like a camera and when it looks like a phone. Kasi yung mga tao sanay na sa ganyang klase mga devices. Next slide. And the great thing about technology nowadays is there is very little, if any, compromise dun sa quality ng mga photos that you're able to take using your mobile device, using your Xiaomi 14T. Dati kasi parang pag gumamit ka ng mobile phone, alam mo na pangit yung quality. It cannot compare to the bigger cameras. Nowadays, because of the innovation that's involved in both the hardware and software component, ang ganda na ng quality ng mga photos. So a couple more photos for you. Next slide. Next slide. Sige, yeah, just a rundown. Ito yung kulay ng dagat, ang ganda ng kulay. Next slide. And last slide for this series. So the great thing about the 14T is that the color science is absolutely beautiful. You take a picture, you don't have to worry about fiddling around with the contrast, with the warmth, with everything. You just have to do very, very basic edits. Actually, the photo is already good to go once you take the photograph. And it performs very well in low light. So these are the things that I really like about the Xiaomi 14E. Lalo na you can take it everywhere, kahit na saan ka magpunta, and you're sure that you're not missing any moment when you have this camera with you. Next slide. Why do I shoot? Tayo ba ako? Okay. This is the privilege of being first. Why do I shoot? And this is the last part of what I want to share with all of you today. The first reason I want to shoot is, next slide, is because I enjoy it. I enjoy taking pictures. I like the process of documenting the things that I see, the people that I meet, and the experiences that I have. At gusto ko yung feeling na parang one day later on, a year, 2 years later, I can go back to these pictures, maalala ko yung ano yung naranasan ko noon, ano yung nakain ko, ano yung feeling ng panahon na yun. And photographs are unique in the sense that it's a very singular way of recording memory. Kasi hindi naman na tayo nabubuhay ng still photographs, di ba? Hindi naman tayo nabubuhay na parang may mga still images. We live like this. So para siyang video. It's very rare that you're able to take a moment and freeze it for eternity. So that's why I like taking pictures, because you're able to freeze one moment that is fleeting and that will never come back again. Next slide. Another reason I like taking pictures is because of the photojournalism aspect. I know that it's important to take a record of what is going on around us, and I know that it's important to share that with a lot of people. Ngayon, uso na yung mga fake news, meron na tayong AI. It's so hard to determine what is real and what is not. So through the job that I do, we go to places and we tell people that these things are happening for posterity. And I think that's one of the main reasons why photojournalism is important. Next slide. And finally, I like taking pictures because it's a form of self-expression. Kapag kumuha ka ng picture, you're leaving a part of yourself in that photograph. Kasi you have to make decisions how you're going to frame the subject, what settings you're going to use, what angle you're going to take. And for me, kahit na I'm taking a picture of someone else, it's usually a reflection of what's going on in my mind. Next slide. I'm able to show people what I think about a certain subject, how it made me feel, and hopefully I also inspire others through the photos that I take. Next slide. And I'm able to inspire people to use their own devices to be able to express themselves, take a record of what's going on, and be visual storytellers as well. So that's why I take photographs, and I hope that you guys enjoy your own journeys using your cameras as well. I think that's the last one. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Atom, for that insightful